So that continuum is interesting. During COVID, when it first hit, obviously I couldn't go to museums, which I love to do, and I couldn't get out and go see things, which I love to do. So I sat in my studio with books and looked at them and drew a lot, and kept drawing, making things. And so behind a lot of these are tons and tons of other drawings and paintings that I was doing at that time. It kind of reminded me of when I first started out painting, and I'd sit in the room and I'd just look at books. And I would look at the illustrations, of course. No, but for the most part, I would just be looking at pictures, and I would draw. And I would go by and memorize as many paintings as I could, and draw after the painters. And there was something about those first few months that was rather refreshing, being able to sit down, stare at books, just draw, and kind of refamiliarize myself with these painters that I love, part of that continuum I was talking about. So there was some brief reprieves from, obviously, what was going on during the COVID thing, and I go up to Thomas Wood's studio. Mandy, who was a great printmaker, was there working in printing, and some of the prints are back there. My wife constantly reminds me, 50% of those are Mandy. Helping out, if not more. But it's true. Just ran into Mandy in the street. But that, those reprieves with Tom were awesome, and his wife Anne. We just go up there and it's like a breath, really, being able to breathe, talk hard, hang out. Marty was there occasionally, David was there, and we just like kids in the sandbox. So that conversation of, I mean, just familiar fun, hanging out and talking to people, is part of the paintings that I make. I want them to be approachable. Now I have to laugh because Marty says, well, people come in here and laugh at your work. For the most part, I think people would go, well, that's insulting. But I'm very happy with that. I love the fact that people look at it and laugh and enjoy it. I think that that's kind of a rare, that comical aspect is kind of rare. And so I'm quite pleased with how that worked out. In particular, while I was doing the COVID lockdown thing, I'd sit in this small room and I'd sketch these rooms, and I had to go paint online and teach painting and drawing online. So one of the exercises I do is a perspective exercise where I have to make boxes that are basically 10 by 10 inches. You know this exercise. Paint perspective exercise. So I have them draw this box and populate it with about 2 windows, a door, a table, and 2 chairs. So I started, because I'm doing this so often, I thought I'm going to make that, turn that into paintings, because something about it, just the interior of it and the paintingness of it, that for me was sort of interesting. So as that developed, they became all sorts of strange things. I usually had people in them and things in them, which I left out of this, and I think it was, for me, I like the movement, not putting anything in there. Kind of, it's more provocative, but it felt like being alone in the studio. But sometimes these would turn into like eyes, a mouth, and a nose. Sometimes it would turn into, you know, this painting. And while I was painting those paintings, it got kind of interesting because I would think about, why don't I just paint the painting that's in the back of the room? And there was probably another narrative going on in my head where I'm like looking out the windows and I'm looking back at paintings, and it was a lot about looking past, present, future. It was just this strange little room that had that ability. There was, for me, to do both. There was one series I did, I think there's one in the prints, where I had somebody walking across the room, and it was sort of like they entered from one side through one door, and they're leaving through the other door, and it was sort of like a lifetime. But it was also kind of this burlesque, ridiculous thing, just this character walking through the room. So during the course of making these, I also had to make some maquettes. So I ended up making these little 3 by 3 inch cubes that I put chairs, a rug, painted a painting, and hung it up just outside our kitchen window. And then I'd photograph it and look through it. And oddly, after like really probably over 100, 200 drawings of this room, and making those maquettes and taking photos of it, then I was able to make the paintings. It had to have that sort of imagination. So I had to walk through all those different possibilities. So it was interesting when I did finally get the photographs, and I noticed it was kind of fuzzy outside, and that the paintings were sort of a weird focal point, but I wanted to paint the paintings after I made them. They kind of just animated themselves. They just kind of jumped off the brush. They were fairly easy because I've done them many times before. I think of like Sui painters who do hundreds and hundreds of things with a few, and that's sort of how it felt doing these. It's like I've done all the work before, and so they just kind of flew off into the brush. And it's about those. And it's got a bit with the boxes. The other thing that I did for this show, because I had time, 2 years to figure this out, is I shifted a couple of things. I changed my palette. I added a few colors. Not a ton, but the palette's a little bit different. So there's some brighter tones. There's some cooler tones. I painted a little bit more thinly. I'd sand everything off if I didn't like it, paint over the top of it. And I think that gave a little bit more luminosity to the colors. I shifted the horizon line, which for me was sort of a big deal, because if you're familiar with my work, there's a lot of stuff, clouds, and the horizon that I've been comfortable painting. And then somehow or other, by shifting that horizon up, I discovered there was something else going on, which was that it started to circulate in a way that's kind of interesting to me, that the sky becomes the landscape, and then the landscape becomes the sky, and it created a certain movement that I found really invigorating and surprised. So I was quite happy with that. And then the other thing which I enjoyed was not thinking. So anytime that I was painting something in this show that I found myself thinking, I would sit down and think about what I was going to say in the talk tonight. And when I got that out of my system, then I go back and paint some more, so that I wasn't, as soon as I thought, this is, gotta do this, or I have to do this, like, nope, it's not gonna work. So most of the paintings, with the exception of the dinosaur with the paintbrushes, paintbrushes can't reach the easel to make the painting. Most of them have absolutely no thought in them whatsoever, other than a few initial starting points. There is one thing I wanted to say about the dinosaurs, though. In the course of making these paintings, for some reason, it popped into my head that I wanted to make a painting for myself when I was 6 years old. Which I have no idea why, but it just seemed like an entertaining thing to do. In fact, our mutual friend Tad came in and laughed the first time he saw it. He says, "You've been painting that since you were in kindergarten." So I didn't know exactly what I painted. So I didn't remember painting a lot of dinosaurs with mountains, volcanoes erupting in the background. So I painted that, and then this became Mount St. Helens, because that blew up when I was 18. So I titled it, we'll just have 61860, because now maybe I'm aware enough that I can see that. But that was kind of revelatory to me. I enjoyed painting that painting for somebody who I knew was 55 years ago or something. Other than that, I asked June at one point, I said, "Did it look like the same person painted all these paintings?" But I agree, I think it does. There was that moment where I thought maybe it wouldn't. But there's a lot of different narratives. Each one kind of has a story, but they're not definitive stories. They're not things where this is definitely out of, yes, it's Adam and Eve, but I changed the narrative a little bit in that one, just because I found it amusing in my own lifetime. Most of them are entirely imagined, with the exception of that one over there, which is out here on the jetty. So that's Anacortes off here somewhere in the distance with the refinery and just walking out there. It was painted from memory, but that was a specific place. And other than that, they're kind of just dreamy. No place in particular. That's about all I have to say. Are there any questions? Yes.
Tell us about the Pierrot.
Yeah.
So that is like a ghost for me. When I used to paint copies in the Louvre, and I go by Gilles or Pierrot in Bateau painting. It's big paintings. I think Gilles is about life size. But every time I walked into the room, I felt like there was an actual person there. It was arresting for me. I would look at it. It was ghostly. I mean, but there was such a presence to Pierrot. And there's something funny about it. I totally identify with it because he looks like a total idiot, but you also realize it's sort of a portrait of the artist, and that there's this kind of thing going on. And then there's the rest of the committee that arte behind him. But you feel, I don't know, I feel like a real identification with that figure. And so when I'm looking at it, it was a ghost. It was kind of a mirror. It did that thing which all great art does, where it might have been painted 300 years ago, but it's very much in the present. It's very immediate now and spoke to me right now. So that was behind these originally. That one I stole the pose from the Loteria, the Mexican Loteria cards. There's a couple figures I think are posed in that sort of dandyish pose. This one cracked me up because it was standing on the frame, on the title, and I thought that was awkward and weird. And sometimes that works. And this one was more like Pierrot, sitting there kind of looking out, and there's like a couple in the background. That was the only one that Pam said was worth showing. Yes, Joel. I have thought about that, but I feel like I'm well, it takes a long time for me to write anything, so I would spend more time painting than writing. And plus, I don't think I'd end up writing very well. I'm about.
Aside from all that, the germination is there, the seeds are there.
For writing?
For narratives, it's still how you work.
Yeah, I think the one problem that I might have with the narrative, or the difficulty that I would have with the narrative, is making it too clear. So most of these kind of have a story, but they don't have a real clear story. So I would have to be like, who's the painter, or the writer, Cesar Aira, I think it is. He's an Argentinian writer who writes these really elliptical short stories. He's a really good writer. But no, I do kind of think about it. The title of this show was very fortuitous. Margie said, I need a title and some images tomorrow. So okay. It was fine. Criticism of Margie, I should have actually been on top of that. So that was what popped into my head. And so that's what I thought, smoke and mirrors. So the smoke, unfortunately, you have to be careful what you think in terms of art. I've noticed, because I had no plan in causing this miasma of smoke that sat over the region for the last month or so, but I feel that has something to do with that's my fault. And the mirrors are that thing of just looking at ourselves, and maybe that's part of the narrative where you're constantly kind of see yourself, but it shifts and changes depending on the perspective.
How about the cats?
Cats are a different story. The cats were originally a commission. When I do commissions, I tend to do too many. I did probably a half dozen of the same painting. The people had a particular cat they loved. They wanted to have an image of the cat. So I painted a bunch of them. I took them over. They chose one that they liked. And then I had a bunch of cats lying around my studio. Not our house, but the studio. And so then I changed them for this. The story, my thinking for that particular painting was that there's a cat they bought a wire painting, which is down here. Look, it's kind of nice because I was looking at books and stuff. There's a bird whistling at the cat's ear, which I think is kind of weird because usually a cat would glass of wine, hanging out, dapperly dressed. It was just kind of a weird story that arose. So it's a little bit clearer. Two different. This one's the reader, which it has something to do with reading pain. Sometimes the titles are clear, sometimes they're not too clear. And this one's here and now. A friend can use that as a meditative mantra. And I kind of like that.
How did the three-dimensional your construction interiors inform you, and why didn't you paint from them rather than from photographs of them, which makes
Well,
three-dimensional?
there's something, each time you deal with a perspective, it shifts things up. So there's a weird thing when I'm looking at the actual model. I think it was making the model that was really exciting. And then when I made it, it was like, well, that's cool. But when I took a picture of it, it turned into something else because it sort of looked real. And I don't know how to describe why that looked real, but then the image, the photographic image to me looked more real than the crummier models. So I thought that was funny. And then especially when I could put them up against the outdoors and have the real sky and the real trees outside the windows, then that was a different dimension. I didn't paint from the photographs, but the photographs inspired me, really inspired me to make the paintings. They kind of set things up. And the 3D quality, there's something, sometimes in the frames I'll paint them in a way where maybe you don't know they're frames or if they're painted. But I like this idea of the frame animating things a little bit like Once Upon a Time, There Was Once. And so that sets up the stage for the narrative that's occurring. What do you think you can now, which I learned, simply because I love the phrase, there was one, there was no one, there was God, and no one else. Sarah and I had extensive conversations about Hafiz, a great Persian poet. But, and she does a ton about it, it's really elucidating to talk about that. But that idea of how you set something up, that magical moment where you go, let's pretend, or once upon a time, for me is a big deal. It sort of launches, I want that sort of launching pad of things, if that makes sense. How to explain these things.
What's your process for the framing then? How do you get your materials?
Process for the, well,
You start with the frame, or you start with the
sometimes
painting?
when I'm bored, sometimes I'll just paint a frame, and then maybe the painting will derive from that. Like there was one, this one was sort of accidental, I sanded it off, and I loved the sort of pink that came with it, and so that turned into the painting, but it sort of felt like that old velvet, I think about 300 years old, like velvet that's kind of crushed and broken in some old painting. So I like that. That was the process of that. I painted the frames, as I told Graves earlier when we met, because I hate framing, but it turns into a big thing anyhow. And I don't hate framing. I just, there's something about having all your paintings ready and then having to carefully cut all the wood, make it look good, and there's like this frantic decision-making process that occurs at the very end of all the exciting discoveries that I wanted to get away from. So I started painting stuff around the frames, and then it turned into other stuff. And I think I refined it a little bit from how I worked before, but that's still there. It's sort of meant to just kind of make you a little, not make you uneasy, but just sort of, oh, and then hopefully that creates more once upon a time. Yes.
Well, yeah, I agree with the framing. It's almost like it belongs to the picture. It's part of it. It should disappear, but it also augments the central part. I was going to say, for such a small scale, there's such luminosity in the oil they're using. It's just been wonderful. They're all fantastic and dreamy, and I love the whole show. But I wanted to just say, how do you do that just to achieve that luminosity of the oil as you're putting on the panel? And are you using an acrylic gesso or an oil ground or nothing? You don't need anything, I guess, but just wondering how to get that, and I showed the frame itself too when you paint images. And you make the frame part of the picture, it certainly intensifies the central part, you get that luminosity, but still, if you're painting with like a really absorbent surface, you might have a more matte look. And I don't know how you're doing it, but it's interesting.
It's not as magical as it might seem, because I did spend many years trying to figure out how to paint forgeries, essentially. When you're doing copies in a museum, you're basically trying to paint the best copy you can show as a forgery. And so I learned all about technique and things like that. At some point, it became cumbersome. I started thinking too much about it. So these, for the most part, some of them are, I have to say, they're just on crummy, cheap canvases like that. I mean, this one's just kind of a crummy, cheap canvas and one of the pastel too that I was talking about earlier. But then what happens is I'll paint something and I won't like it. I'll sand it off. And I'll sand it off. So eventually it becomes like an oil ground, thin oil ground. And that has a certain degree of luminosity. When I'm painting, I try to keep things simple. So I think in terms of three, I think three values, like light, middle, dark. And then of course there's more than that, but I try to stay with that. And it was something I was thinking about in a lot of these landscapes where I'd also go from cool to warm, but they weren't heavy thoughts. It was just kind of like, okay, I'm going to use that, I'm going to use that. And keeping it thin helps the luminosity. That was something my teacher Frank was big on. Frank O'Connor was really talking about that. Painting luminous colors were a big deal. And to get that, you paint it thinly on bright grounds. Paint it intensely, but thinly.
So then therefore the ground reflects all that,
Yeah, it's transparent enough. Now, some of them you can see are a little matte, and they probably have more absorbent grounds where I haven't. Or in some cases, like this feels a little matte to me, but I like the madness. It's kind of like the skies and things around it. But that probably had little. It probably hadn't been sanded down so many times. I probably had a couple of layers of oil in there and just went with it and put it on. Glazing stuff. Like the one to its left, the one with the black frame with the figure down in the water, that one has several glazes and very thin on top of what I remember painting. So that gave it a lot of luminosity. Plus the black frame intensifies that, I think. So I do think about these things, but in retrospect, while I'm doing it, that was a total accident. I didn't know that would work. I just looked at it and thought, and see what happens. I didn't like the painting where it was at. I put in the darker values, and then I was like, I want to keep this painting. So I like that.
So, start a little bit about your comedic process and how you bring that into your how does that? I mean, you talked a little bit about your 8-year-old depending on self when paint transverses. How do you decide how to include what you include in your larger stuff? Is it from the little small steamboats to
I sometimes I'll start with something like an idea. Usually I have to get rid of it. I mean, it has to change a little bit, and usually in the process of getting rid of it, there was something that struck me as funny, like a strange collision of things. And when that happens, I learn to listen to that. Because I know if I laugh, then probably the viewers will laugh. Or if I'm happy when it occurs, then probably the viewers will also be happy. And so I want that sentiment passed on. But it's a really quiet voice. So I had to train myself to listen to it, because it's very easy just to like, yeah, it's funny. I'm not very smart, so ignore it.
So most of your paintings are landscapes, but it doesn't sound like you paint outside the studio very often. Is it true? And if so, are you doing sort of collages from other paint prints, or are you doing it from imagination?
I do most of them. They're almost entirely from imagination. combination. I might have some starting points with a couple of them. There was, in some of the rooms I used, there's a painter called Pierrot, 16th century, flourished painter. And there was something about those designs that I liked and looked at. I used to look at his one painting of the room. So I have an old dog-eared, oil-stained, broken spine edition of the Louvre's paintings, and I'll thumb through that and look at stuff and see what catches my eye. But in general, I just make them up. Like this, I just threw some light down, I scraped the palette knife across the mountains to make them occur, and then the ground, the same thing. And then I thought, let's need some figures in it, and then I just threw the figures in, and that's where it went. And I had no. Then I stand back and look at them. If I like it, then I go, oh, that's kind of interesting, but I don't like it, then I stand back. Right.
Yeah, that's, I was thinking about your figures, this show, you have a lot more figures in your landscapes than I've really ever seen. I love how delicately they're painted. I don't know if it's delicate, but it's like barely a stroke or two and there's a figure. And it's interesting that your rooms are empty, but your landscapes are populated.
I know.
Like, what's with that? No, it's
It's the kind of, the lights are on, but nobody's home.
Yeah, but that's just an observation, but I also want to say your work is very touching to me on another level. It's not always just chuckle. It's very touching. You have two border paintings here. I don't know if they're supposed to be border crossings. I don't know if that's too big of a question, if you even want to talk about that. But I remember in your show 2 years ago, you had a drift, which looked like boat. And so it's the subtlety sneaks up in really a wonderful way, and it's really like a full emotional, the full spectrum of the emotions that I like to.
Well, my background is Swedish, so I really like that depressing stuff. Hard for me at times to completely get rid of that. And I do think, in fact, that when you look at we were talking about the Pierrot earlier, when you look at that, it's sad.
Yeah.
It's a melancholy painting.
Yeah.
But it's funny, but it's not. And I think that that collision of those two things, yes, when I think about border, I'm thinking about, the perimeter of the frame and stuff like that. I'm thinking about that margin of land between here and there. I'll think about, if I see people and I go, oh, that could be this, that definitely crops up, and it happens. The danger for me in that is if it becomes too much about that, then there's no relief or visual relief. So usually there's some other trajectory that I go on. I mean, the whale painting for me is kind of sad. It's sort of real. I don't know. Sort of like that. And that was, sort of like what we did was sad in many ways. Chasing the whale and that sort of that quest that is predetermined to be a disaster. I mean, there's a lot of tragedy in that, but there's also something passionate about it. And I think for me, when the work gets interesting is when you have those uncontrollable things butting heads at times. So they are kind of funny, but they're also sad about the passage of time. There's a melancholy, but also a humor. For me, I like that kind of juggling between them. I'm the couple in the painting there. What do you call them, the monk and the nun? Or
No, I call them the virgin and the priest.
Virgin and priest. Well, Margie would be my titles from now. I mean, there's something comical about it. I totally agree with that. But there's also something sad because they're never going to meet. They're always going to have that landscape between them. So it's like, it's just one, maybe so, just as well. Never know what's gonna happen. But, it's kind of funny. That
Yeah.
is part of the pain. So, any more questions? Thank you all so much for showing up and hanging out, talking pain with me. That's awesome. I love it. And thank you.